Hello, everyone. I'm Gaynor Senyszyn, and I'm ILTA's Director of Education. I'm here with Darrell Mervau, who is the president of FileTrail. Hi, Darrell. Can you take a minute to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, Gaynor. Thank you for having me. My name is Darrell Mervau. I'm the president of FileTrail. And if you're not familiar with FileTrail, we're a software company based in Austin, Texas, that is focused on information governance and records management. So I'm happy to be here today.
Darrell, I was wondering, are you hearing more about compliance now than you did before the pandemic? And how have the questions from law firms and law departments changed in that time?
Well, when the pandemic started and when the shutdowns first started happening back in March of 2020, we really started hearing from our customers and other law firms about, how can your software help us manage some of the policies? And when we started hearing that, we actually sent out a survey out to law firms across the board to see what some of the issues that they're seeing with the compliance issues around going to work at home. And we had some really interesting responses, and some of them on the larger firms, they were somewhat prepared, some were very prepared. Some of them told us that they implemented all of this practice kind of around a disaster recovery operation so that they're ready to move into this work from home based on some of their disaster recovery preparedness. And others were saying that it threw them because a lot of attorneys had never worked from home, right? So they didn't have the space, they weren't, all of those basic things. And it really was different from firm to firm. But some of the really interesting thing that came out of it that last year that we saw was that firms were coming to us saying, we really need to now pay attention to our policies, right? And not that they've always been focused on that security policy area because that protection of that data is so important. And they really came to us to start talking about that life cycle of the content. And because now they were really focused on, okay, we probably are going to have content starting to go in new repositories. So how are we going to start looking at that and managing that too? And one of the obvious ones was Teams. As the pandemic went on further and further, we had more questions coming out of, how can we manage? We're seeing data going into Teams. How can we manage that? Which actually goes up into a different repository. So looking at that. And one of the things that we really found that was interesting is we saw that some of this was being driven because people weren't in the office. So they had some of their IG and records management people having the time to really focus on those policies, right? And start looking at how can we implement against these things that we've had approved. Now we need to make them actionable. And because I'm not in the office, I don't have 10 other things coming at me at once. So I can start looking at this and digging into this. And so one of the other questions that came out of this is having the time to dive into that, doing some of that data, visibility into the data. Where are our repositories? Where is the data, sitting? One of the things that also came about was, how can I archive some of this data now? So we have all of this data, but not all of it is valuable. So there's a lot of different. During the pandemic, we were having a lot of different conversations with firms around, how do I look at this data now and being compliant with the data because we're working from home now? What policies do we need to put in place? They all have, okay, you're going to work from home. You all have these directives about what your data is. The firms that were already in cloud-based systems like NetDocs, I think, had a little easier transition than some of maybe mid-sized smaller firms or firms that had to go through VPN access or different ways to access the data. So there was a lot of different activity around that. And we saw some of the first executions of destroying electronic documents based on policies during the pandemic. And I think that was, because people are like, we've been hoarding this data forever. We really need to focus on it and execute against policies that we've had in place for 5 years, 10 years, whatever they were.
So when you look back over the past year, what do you think are the most important compliance issues you think law practices faced?
Well, I think some of them have been growing for the last couple of years, right? It's pre-pandemic, and that's outside counsel guidelines and regulatory issues, right? And the regulatory issues are slowing down. We can see, similar CCPA type regulatory issues happening in other states now, and that'll keep going. It'll be the GDPR of North America. That's going to happen at some point, as we see these different things happening with personal data on social media and other areas. So that'll continue to happen. And then the outside counsel guidelines pressure was, coming in before the pandemic, and that's just going to increase more and more. And again, I go back to the shift to the cloud. You're going to see more and more people saying, okay, I'm shifting to the cloud. I'm looking at my data. There is a cost, even though people think storage is cheap or inexpensive, it really isn't at the end of the day when you're talking about the volumes of data that people are dealing with. So they're looking at, what is the value of this data that I'm keeping? So, we always talk to firms and they say, I have all of this data and the matter's been closed for 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, but the attorney still says there's value in that. I worked on this contract or this case 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I may need to mine that, information. So maybe that should go into the knowledge management system and not sit in the DM or not sit in a file share somewhere, or maybe because it's 20 years old, you shouldn't even reference it because the world has changed so much, right? So we should execute against, execute against those records that are that old. So a lot of the conversations that we're hearing is, let's take a point in time and say, this data really doesn't have much value anymore. And let's start doing something with it. So the biggest risk with not being compliant against your policies that you've spent a lot of money on getting approved and bringing in outside consultants to help you develop those. The biggest risk of that is that you're telling clients that we have a policy, we operate this way, and then not operating that way, right? That's the biggest risk. And the other big risk is that you have this data that if there is, for some reason, a disgruntled employee or something, takes place that some of that is exposed. Is it an existing client? Is it an old client that is no longer a client? I mean, there's just risk of data exposure with keeping that data around, and that risk of, telling clients that you're following a policy and then not hitting that, or telling clients you agree to outside counsel guidelines and then not meeting those. So yeah, all of those things. I have a little bit of an anecdote around that. We actually work with a very large AmLaw 100 firm that told us a story that, they actually had a client. They didn't lose the client, but they lost a large matter that came in and said, do you have matter in data from the last matter that related to this topic, and so on and so forth? And they said, yes, we do. And they said, well, we can't work with you on this matter because our outside counsel guidelines laid out that you had to either destroy that data, notify us, or return to client, right? So none of those took place. So they didn't lose a client, but they lost a very significant matter. So.
Interesting. So what do you see firms dealing with in the coming years? What should they be focusing on when it comes to compliance issues?
I think it's you know, you can't ignore it. So there's two, you have that, the compliance side, which really, even though it takes this administrative, no, I don't want to say backroom point of view, but it's an administrative process, and, you know, to make sure we're all compliant. And then the attorney side is you know, revenue driven, taking care of clients, that type of side. The biggest thing is those two are intersecting so much with outside counsel guidelines and regulatory areas that really the technology needs to come into play, right? So our clients that have executed disposition against data and have worked to put in this IG, you know, compliance areas, you know, they all say it's a journey, right? Well, it's a journey, but you want to define an end point. You know, it's a journey, but where's the destination? You know, the destination is to get to having technology that helps us give visibility into our data and how it's impacted by our policies, right? Or compliance issues like GDPR, CCPA. So having visibility into that, and then having the ability to see where does the risk lie. And if there's an activity that we have to execute against, let's make that actionable without having it become a burden on resources, right? And that's where technology comes in. That's where technology will take care of those things. The biggest thing that we're seeing in coming out of the pandemic, and you can read it in any law firm press these days, is mergers are going to take off. You're going to see, you know, a bunch of mergers in this year, next year, a couple of years from now, and that impacts all of that data, right? That transition of attorneys, those lateral moves, what takes place to that. You can see in, you know, legal newsletters today, issues that are already coming out of that because of lateral moves and you know, different cases that are coming out of that where data left earlier than it should have left the previous firm and things like that. So those are more compliance areas that are impacting, that are going to be a big impact in the future, along with, you know, the normal things that we're already seeing with the increase in outside counsel guidelines. And clients really want to know that they know your data is secure because that questionnaire is in there. Everybody answers that question. You know, all of the law firms have, you know, the security officers ready with all the answers with that. You have systems now, cloud systems that, you know, can protect that data so that people feel comfortable about putting the data up in the cloud. So all of that is in place. It's going to be, you know, if that RFP says, do you have policies around our data as it relates to the life cycle, how are you going to execute against that? Or how are you going to return to client? If I say, you know, a year from now, a year after matter close, you need to return our data, how are you going to do that without it becoming a burden? So I think it's mergers are big, that lateral, you know, the whole lateral moves, and monitoring that risk. What does that risk look like, you know, when you're dealing across, you know, all of these different components that are coming at you from the clients and attorneys coming in and leaving, and then your existing policies and regulatory areas. So.
Well, big thank you, Darrell, and to FileTrail for your support of ILTA, the Compliance Summit, and your thought leadership. Darrell, how can people contact you if they have any follow-up questions?
Two different ways. They can go out to my LinkedIn site, which is just Darrell Mervau. You can see the spelling of my last name. Or you can email me, and it's my first initial last name at filetrail.com.
Thank you, Darrell.
Thank you.